Welcome everybody. I think it's really a relevant topic, evictions and rentals. I hope everybody can see the slides. I'm going to the second page. Our speaker today is Heinrich Schmidt. Please mute yourself, Dee. All right. Our speaker is Heinrich Schmidt. He's a friend of mine. We did our articles at the same time, around about 91, 92, 93, around about there. So I've known Heinrich for many years. Heinrich grew up in Edenvale, graduated with a BCom law degree from the University of Victoria in 92. He was admitted as an attorney in 1993. And he did his articles here in Benoni with Skalk Brits. Remember, Skalk Brits was our speaker at our previous, at our first seminar this year at Benoni Country Club. In 92, Heinrich successfully wrote the board exam for estate agents to encourage his parents, who both started a career in real estate at that point. Nayela, please mute yourself. Anyway, Heinrich joined Bennett McNaughton, attorneys in Edenvale in 1995 and became a partner at the firm in 1998. He's also admitted conveyancer and a specialist property attorney. During his articles in Benoni, he focused on debt collection and rent interdicts, and later at Bennett McNaughton learned foreclosures and evictions. In 2004, he started a separate property management business to assist clients with managed rent collections. And that's mainly the reason why we've got Hein here today as our speaker. He's responsible for more than 250 rental properties, and he's also completed close to 500 residential and commercial evictions. I mean, we can't ask for anybody with more experience than Hein. Hein, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for spending time with us and give us your valuable knowledge, sharing it with us. There you are. Heinrich, thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to your knowledge, sharing it with us. And over to you.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you for everyone who's taking their time to join in and listen today. I hope that you will learn something. I'll share a secret with you. To this day, I'm still learning. To this day, I haven't found the perfect formula. What I'm going to try and do today is just share some of the trends that I see. It's a beautiful thing with data is that if you, as an agent in your lifetime, you may run into an eviction or bad tenant or really bad tenant 2 or 3 times. When you wear your hat as an attorney, especially someone who specializes in this stuff, you start seeing trends. Without going off script, I can give you an example. We have a tenant in Edenvale who I have evicted 3 different times for 3 different landlords. And he lives within 1 block in Edenvale, and he shifts around in 1 block. 3 different agents, 3 different landlords. So the funny thing is when you look at him, you can see the trends. You can see the way he behaves. You can see the way he cons people. What I'm going to try and do today is just share some thoughts with you around that, share some history with you, and see if I can get you to be more alert, get you to protect yourself, your agency, and your landlord. And obviously, on a bigger scale, to protect the industry. Because without the property industry, we really have no business. 2 examples, quick one that I can share with you. Real life matter. A shareholder in an estate agency, but someone who's not involved in the day-to-day running as a tenant in his property. The tenant was found and placed by one of his employees. So the rental agent in his agency, which he owns, found him a tenant. Because he didn't want the business and his private stuff to get mixed up, he decided to manage the property himself, and everything went well until the tenant's money runs out. And it's at this point that he comes to see me it now emerges that the tenant is a lawyer who's fallen on hard times. When I start asking the hard questions about what's the background of this individual, the only background work that was done is a credit check which no one can find, and the guy's bank statements that were given before he signed the lease. The last thing the tenant told my landlord before things got hostile was that he is claiming his so-called squatter rights, something we'll hear about again. Got another one that is an absolute beauty, and I'll tell you in a second why. An agent showed a prospective tenant an upmarket property. The tenant wants the property right away and he doesn't want to wait. He says he doesn't need to complete an application, doesn't need to go through a credit check because he's going to put down the placement fee, which is a month's rent, the deposit, and a year's rent up in advance. Put it in the landlord's account straight away. Landlord says, happiness, what can go wrong? He's got his rent. And then in month 11, with no property management taking place because there's no rent to collect, the landlord gets a very, very large account from the municipality for water and electricity. And he's kind of surprised because there's a prepaid meter for the electricity. And in an unbelievable coincidence and convergence of facts, that very week, the Financial Intelligence Center, or the FIC, or FICA, as you would call it, contacted the agent for a routine audit. The landlord is very unhappy because in that very same week, he finds out that the tenant who had paid the rent in advance was a convicted fraudster from an East European country with known terrorist links. As agents, you guys are in a very difficult spot, and I've worn both hats as property manager or agent and as the rental attorney. The landlord places pressure on you. He wants you to fill his place, get me a good tenant. He wants to do a deal on commission, cut your com and your placement fee, and he'll even try and tell you he can manage it himself. The agent knows that it's very difficult to find good tenants, may very often be up against other competing agents, and it's the one who presents the best tenant or tries to present the best tenant that gets the business. And then deals with an owner who doesn't really understand what you have to go through to do a successful rental placement, and then manage the deal. Of course, when things go wrong, the attorney gets to ask difficult questions like, who found the tenant? They consider questions like, can we sue the agent for this mess because we now have 100,000 rands rent outstanding and the place is trashed? And then asks for background documents and all sorts of evidence that is required. And of course, asks another hard question to both the agent and the landlord. What did you try and do yourself before you came to see me? It's really a challenge. I want you to see the next points in the slides we've prepared through the following analogy. I always say to people that risk management, and it works very well when you deal with a property, risk management is like breakfast. Everyone wants to be the chicken. The chicken gives the egg, and the chicken is involved in breakfast. Nobody wants to be the pig. The pig gives the bacon, and he's committed to breakfast. The landlord is committed to the transaction because he gives his property. He's got a lot to lose. But unfortunately, our legal system and the laws of the land favor the tenant overwhelmingly. And your job is to turn every chicken into a pig and to make sure the tenant is as committed or as committed as he can be, and that he has or she has something to lose in the process. And I think that is the context against which we want to run today's slides. Jan, can you turn the page for me, please? Oh, that slide is good. Sorry, my apologies. One back. I was quick on the trigger there. So moving to our first slide, I think for me, this is the start of the toolbox that you're going to have to look at if you're going to avoid tenant problems. We've noted a few issues there. It's good to have a rental application form. Why? Because there's POPIA on the scene now. You've got the Consumer Protection Act, which is about 11 years old now. And you've got the FIC or the FICA. Just want to tell you, attended a roadshow last week, and they are actively pursuing conveyancing attorneys and property practitioners or estate agents. They've identified that as the weak link in the chain, and they are actively looking for people to audit. Your application form is the start of your journey to make sure that you are compliant with FICA. From a POPIA perspective, it ticks the box because in that application, you can get the tenant to consent to the processing of the information. And in that context, it is the framework, it is the place when the person wants that property, it is the place where you can get them to consent to stuff going forward. I believe it's too late to put POPIA in a lease, personally, because sometimes the deal develops problems before the lease is signed. So when I go with an application form, I would say that you need to have at least the following: the name and identity number of every adult who will be staying at the property, regardless of their credit record, details of whether they're employed or not. If they are self-employed, you would need 6 months bank statements or other confirmation of income. I don't think a letter from an accountant no one knows is good confirmation. If the person is employed, some pay slips. Like to know where the tenant currently lives and the landlord details. Obviously, I've mentioned the consent to a credit check, and then, of course, the reporting of data. This is a fantastic tool if things go wrong in the future. I want to just come back to the landlord reference. I know it's a very popular thing. Pick up the phone, phone someone, and they give a good reference. You can even go so far to check that the person is the owner of the property. I've actually encountered in practice that we have people who will purposefully give a poor reference on a tenant. Landlord may be unhappy with a tenant. Tenant owes money, and they agree that the landlord will give a good reference in exchange for the tenant moving. I've actually done an eviction like that. So please be careful. Don't rely blindly on a telephone call to a person you don't know who vouches for another person you don't know. Use it as part of the information that you consider when you look at an applicant and see if it's a worthwhile applicant to put forward to your landlord. Jan, next slide, please. I want to just start by saying I hope that apart from maybe one more reference to POPIA, I don't have to mention it again. I've been responsible for POPIA implementation at both our practice and in the property management business. It is incredibly painful to do this. There's a lot of miscommunication about it, and it complicates matters. In our property management business, for instance, we had a tenant already, a tenant wanting to climb out of a lease, then simply claiming that their data should be destroyed, which they're entitled to, depending on your privacy policy. So I think one must take a very, very careful view in terms of POPIA. You put POPIA in your application up front. You make sure that you know how long you're going to keep that information, what you're going to do with it, and when you're going to destroy it. Obviously, your consent in the application, for instance, like your credit check consent, will say what you can do with it. But I need you to look beyond this. You know, when things go bad, we use the information in a good rental application. It's a good photo of what the personal circumstances
of the tenant was at the time the lease was concluded. It helps us to recover funds if we need to look, if things go bad. It protects the agent when the landlord says, you just put anyone in my property, which is a vital thing, because when things go bad, the reality is you're sitting with a bad tenant. The landlord very often wants to blame someone, and the agent seems to be a very good target to blame. In that respect, you can use the information to protect yourself. I want to suggest something just very simple in terms of information management. You know, when a deal is done, if you have a deal file on a lease, I've seen amongst my clients who rent out property that they may have that file around and goes into the cabinet and it comes out again. I want to maybe suggest something to you, if you're comfortable with this, that you have a dual system, that you have maybe a box like a paper box, one of these ones that your paper comes in, typec box, or another box, maybe a metro file box, and you keep one for every month or every year, and you mark it as such. At the same time, whatever you get in by email, and then at the end of the day, with your lease application and your lease, once those documents are done, you scan those and you keep them on a digital folder. And you put the paper away, because the more people that handle paper, the more likely is someone's going to take something out of a file and it will go missing. And if you need to refer to it at a future date, you can't. The beauty of this is, once you look at a year, let's pick a bad year, let's pick 2020. You'll get to 2025 and you'll see that file or that year has aged, it's reached its 5-year term, which is a good time to destroy, and you can destroy the entire 2020 in one go. And I think all of us who survive 2020 will be quite happy to destroy that year. I would also suggest that that your digital stuff doesn't sit on someone's laptop and is inaccessible. I would use a simple cloud backup like Dropbox, or use OneDrive that comes with your Microsoft license, and make sure there's at least one external backup. If you do that, you are unlikely to get yourself into trouble. If you do have an audit from the FIC, or if when POPIA starts doing site visits, the POPIA regulator, you'll be able to show that you handle, that you process, and you destroy data in an appropriate way, and that it is controlled and that it is scientific. And I think that would tick all your boxes. It also helps you not to have to dig out a file every time and to hope that it's intact. If you can turn the page for me, yeah? Short word about debit orders. So the problem with making anything completely automatic is the fact that you may feel relaxed and that you don't stay focused and keep your eye on the ball. There are cases, however, where a debit order is a fantastic tool. I mean, your risk is, for instance, you run the debit order, the tenant bounces the debit order and the fees get written back to your account. I mean, that's an obvious risk. There was a debit order scam going on some time ago, I think with Debit. Now it's probably been eradicated, but just to give you an idea of how crooked some people can be, there was a situation where someone was selling buildings that were apparently being managed, and these came with debit orders. So an agent that was looking to bolster his portfolio went in, tried to buy an entire portfolio with the debit orders. Debit orders were nicely signed over. The deal was that when the leases are transferred, with physical leases are transferred to the agent who bought the business, and the debit orders have been signed, purchase price is paid. He paid his 100 or 150,000 rand, only to realize on day 2 of his new business that the debit orders were forgeries. They were bounced.
they were bouncing against non-existent accounts, and he was out of pocket with his purchase price. So be careful if someone offers you a nicely packaged rental business. Good case study for me where debit order does work well. I don't know if I quote the figure completely correctly, but we had a local government employee in our rental management business who applied for a property. He had a gigantic salary. I think it was like 90,000 Rand a month. But he had 2 judgments. I think he had 3 defaults. I think he owned his own investment property, not locally, but he had his own property. And in that instance, what we used, we looked at his bank statements. Because if there's one thing the municipality does well with its employees is to make sure they get paid on time. And I think if his payday was regularly the 26th, we just made sure that we were first in the queue. And even though he appeared to be a high-risk tenant, the fact that his debit order was met on time meant that we had a nice run with him. From that perspective, a debit order will do wonders for your portfolio. Just be careful that you are dealing with an account where you would feel comfortable that the money would come automatically. Firstly. Secondly, that you don't take your eye off the ball. You could even lose out on your renewals because the money keeps coming in and there's no reason to look at that transaction again. Thanks, Jan. This is quite a good one for me. We started using the word proper with reference to one of my oldest clients who've been with me a long time, just so happens to be a landlord, but I've done lots of stuff for him. And he always said there were 2 types of things. There were proper things and stuff that wasn't quite proper. And when we started doing rental work many years ago, there were no prepaid meters. There was a municipal account that went out once a month. The municipal account was sent by mail. There was no email. And the agent would load the water and electricity onto the rental account, and that's how it was paid. At the same time, it was quite popular for people to have the tenant go and open his own account. That was actually quite a thing at one stage. So a lease would be signed, the tenant would go to the municipality, pay a deposit, and then receive the municipal account directly. Now, with the advent of the Municipal Systems Act and legislation that followed, it became a firm rule that the landlord or the registered owner of the property is responsible for all the municipal consumption. When that came out, the technology advanced to the point where prepaid meters could go in. And for purpose of this, I would simply say a aftermarket prepaid meter, or cheaper nasty as I call them. It's a prepaid meter that's installed next to existing distribution board. Tenant buys the prepaid tokens from the garage or whoever sells them or online. He gets a token number, he punches it in, and he has electricity. That money then, through a sophisticated chain, ends up back in the hands of the landlord. The vendor pays a sub-vendor, or the sub-vendor pays a vendor, and there are 2 or 3 people in the chain, and normally the landlord would get his money less, approximately 12, 13, 14%. And that's fine as long as you keep an eye on what is being bought. You see, because with that aftermarket prepaid, your landlord still gets an electrical account. The idea is that the money that comes in off the prepaid meter almost matches that which comes, that which he receives by way of account from the municipality. Someone's got to watch that thing. And I have personally invested in a building with a few other people where the tenant decided to do some creative electrical work, bridged one of the meters, then figured out that you can do some really fancy things with a meter if you bridge it. And we ended up having to pay, between a lot of us, we paid in 250,000 Rand to the municipality. That really does put a big dent in your in your investment. And normally your tenant is gone by the time this is discovered. So a proper, I call it proper prepaid, is a smart meter. It is a meter which either has a GSM SIM card inside or is internet enabled, and that sounds a siren when it is tampered with. That's the very first thing you need to know. And the siren must not be triggered in the building. It must be triggered with either the person who manages the meters, or a notification must go to the managing agent so that they know there is interference with the meter. A proper prepaid meter will also be able to provide you with fairly close to real-time consumption, would be able to show you what is being used at a property in a specific week, and should be able to help you to pick up trends in consumption, leaks, if there's a smart water meter, or if the amount of consumption suddenly jumps or doubles. It is a fantastic tool. Normally, every rental account consists of either rent or consists normally of rent and utilities, and it helps you manage that utility portion. Just once again, keep your eye on the ball. Don't expect that it's the only tool that will help you manage the property. Thanks, Jan. This is one of my absolute favorites. If you've been in the rental industry for a while, the likelihood that you've seen this in action is quite good. Let me try and explain to you by way of a case study. This is very close to an actual set of facts that we encountered. So John and Sally are a couple, and they decide they want to move in together and rent the property together. Let's say for purposes of this that John is an industrial equipment salesman. He gets a big salary, and he gets a commission on top of that. Sally is a wonderful lady, but unfortunately just started her own little business, and she doesn't have a lot of regular income. She doesn't have a pay slip. So as agent, you decide to put the lease in John's name and simply say to the owner that Sally will be living with him. Landlord looks at the income, you look at the income, everything looks good. And for about 5 months, everything goes well. Around the 6th of the following month, just after the rent was paid and it was nicely paid on time, let's say it's June, they break up and John moves out. No one is told about this. Sally has a new boyfriend very soon, probably within that month. And then by the 7th of the next month, he moves in. He is, as we would say, between jobs. You are still none the wiser, and you decide to follow up on the rent because in July, no rent is paid. Sally is very vague. She says they've hit some difficulties, but it'll be sorted shortly, probably before the end of the month. Sometimes they'll even say we'll make a double payment. Unfortunately, it's winter. People are unhappy in winter, and the relationship goes under. And Sally feels trapped. She doesn't know what to do. So she takes the lease and the paperwork that John left behind when he left in a hurry, and she goes to speak to someone who has a bit of legal knowledge. They look at the lease, and they see that her name's not on the lease. She just says there will be 2 people living in the property. So she decides she wants to make a fresh start. She moves out, moves in with her parents. New boyfriend has to recover from the shock of the lost relationship and decides to fix it by having a nice big party. He has that following weekend, and he breaks all the rules in the complex. The people park all over. They have a great party. They overcrowd the place. The people go into the public and common areas, and they have a crack of a party. Unfortunately, the way you find out about this is when the landlord sends the notice that the body corporate sent him on the Monday via their attorney with a notice that he's been fined. And he asks, what is going on in my property? Because you are absolutely in the dark. So what do you do? Who's your tenant? Because the original people you dealt with aren't there. And like, what about the deposit? So this is an actual situation. In practice, I've seen this several times. People who move in, move out. If it's a lease of maybe 3 or 4 years, sometimes the people move out so much, and they swap beds so much that you eventually don't know who's living in the place. And inevitably you discover it when there are problems. So the way to deal with this, you can't stop the party, obviously. But here are the things that you could probably do. I always insist that all the grown-ups who are going to be living in the property sign the lease, whether they have a good, bad, or no credit record. We can figure out from the analogy of the pig and the chicken who will be responsible for the rent and the damage later. But the more people on the lease, the better. If everyone signs the lease, everyone signs the conduct rules. This increases your chances of making sure that you can hold someone to those conduct rules and that you can show that you've done it. If one partner in the relationship leaves and one partner in the lease leaves, because sometimes friends move in together and you find out about it, you immediately need to look at your application and see whether there's affordability for the other one and whether they can continue. If a new person, and sometimes people are courteous enough to say, I've got someone moving in with me, is that the problem? You say to them, let them complete an application. Get everything on them. Get their ID. Get a full background on them. Look at the affordability again and have a mature conversation with your remaining tenant or occupier. We recently, just recently, had a case where a daughter was a shaky applicant, but then introduced her mother to the transaction. Mother owns a house and mother is a person of good standing. Mother signs an application form. When things go wrong, when you make contact with mother, it turns out that mother's signature was forged on the application and on the lease. So you can almost never go far enough to make sure that you are familiar with all the people on your lease. Just as a matter of interest, if this set of facts came to me, you need to evict the people in the property if they won't leave. The other thing I would do is, if I had everyone humanly possible on the lease, you can sue those people whether they are still in the property or not. Because if they didn't give notice, the lease is alive and the obligation to pay the rent carries on. So in a case like this, I guess you could go and visit John, and you could go visit Sally, and when the summons arrives, hopefully some money will come and they'll bring the pressure to the existing occupier to get them out. Thanks, Jan. Okay, inspections and check-ins. Yeah, this is a favorite of mine. I'm going to go off the script here and just quickly run you through some stuff. 30% of the inspections that I see in legal rental matters are compliant. In other words, people come to me and they either have no inspection or the inspection wasn't done properly. So the Rental Housing Act is actually quite clear on this. It says if you don't do the inspection properly, you can't claim for damages against the deposit. So for it to be a valid inspection, you at least need to be present yourself. The tenant has to be present. You have to have an actual document that is completed and signed that shows the condition of the property. And when the tenant moves out, that process has to be completed. I'm not going to go into the technical details, but if you don't tick those boxes, you don't have a valid inspection. Photos aren't an inspection. An inspection without the tenant is not an inspection, except the tenant didn't cooperate. An inspection without the landlord or the agent present is not an inspection. And my favorite that I see in a lot of old leases, you cannot put a clause in your lease to say the parties agree that the property was handed over in good condition. Can't do that. I'd be careful of people unnecessarily fault finding at the check-in inspection. People wanting to deduct rent to deduct a repair from a rent, saying, I see there's a tap leaking, I'll do it and deduct it off the rent. Deducting money off rent becomes a habit. Most leases say that you have to pay the full rent and you can't set off money against it. Don't let deductions become a habit, because deductions mean you have disputes over the outstanding rent, and that leads to all sorts of nonsense you don't want. Even if your lease doesn't state that you can do periodic inspections or for marketing purposes, the Rental Housing Act extension to the regulations, they've got a codified set of behaviors they approve, says that if you give proper notice at a reasonable time, you're allowed to visit a property for marketing purposes. And if a tenant refuses you access when you've given proper notice and you come at a reasonable time and you've given them alternatives, then the tenant is in breach of the lease. Last one, that's quite funny. If the tenant doesn't arrive with furniture on the day the lease starts, or with someone else's furniture, I think you can flag that lease as a potential problem. Thanks, Jan. So lease renewals. Depending on your business model, you may or may not have an arrangement to charge a fee. Sometimes people charge a commission for the lease renewal. So lease renewal is a fantastic opportunity to look at risk, to make sure that things are still good. From my experience, I normally see that the average renewal is basically a quick WhatsApp and an email. Sometimes people will even do an addendum. Because when the rent is coming in, no one worries about anything else. But you must remember that the asset that you're managing may be worth $1 million, maybe more. And there's substantial risk for your landlord there. If you're managing the property, the condition of the property is critical. Yeah, I look at what I would say is best practice. For me, if you ask me what is best practice, and I understand that it's not always possible, when the renewal comes up, I would maybe try and ask the tenant if I could do a routine inspection, have a look around the place and see that everything is still as it should have been when the tenant moved in. Expect to see a fairly clean property that looks homely and where people have settled in. I would expect not to see any new or fresh faces. I'd expect the property not to be overcrowded, not at least in terms of what we put in the lease application. I then do a quick credit check, TPN or TransUnion or Experian, and I would check if employment has changed. I would check if the credit record has changed. And only at that point would I have the chat with my landlord to say, the lease is coming up for renewal. So we have a look at that. I've discovered the following. Do you want me to do anything about this? Does it affect your decision to renew? It is, after all, the landlord's decision to renew the property or renew the lease on the property. It is his property. And we've got to do our best to look after him. It also avoids that uncomfortable discussion at a later stage when the landlord says to you, but I paid you to renew the lease. Weren't you there? How long has this been going on? You know, the classic situation of water leaks. Water leaks is a classic example. People just leave a water leak in a cupboard. It means nothing to them. But if you have to redo the kitchen cupboards, if the property allows it, quick, between 5 and 20,000 Rand, it may not be arrears, but it's going to be damages, and your deposit will probably not cover that. So I do the credit check, and then finally, if all parties are happy, I would want to do an addendum, make sure it's properly signed, and then stick it in my filing system and make a note for when it comes up for renewal. Thanks, Jan. Yes. I think when I hear the words a good lease, a good tenant, those are words that you often hear in this industry and that people talk about. And the thing is, I've seen so-called good leases where a lease starts out a decent lease, and then people take to creative writing. This is the one thing that one can learn, where if you wonder if an attorney is useful, Jan, I hope you and I can at least appear to be useful at the end of this. The fact that you know how to type or write does not qualify you to play with a legal document, because you can make a legal document a void document, one that has no legal power, if you try and add your own creative writing. For instance, and these are some of the classics I see. A local estate agent in our area has this in her standard lease: I waive my rights to invoke my squatter rights. So that one is in contravention of the Constitution. The other one, you can't, for instance, go and override other legislation like the Rental Housing Act. I see some people wanting to keep the interest on the deposit, not pay over interest. Can't do that. It's against the law. It's actually codified in our statutes in South Africa. I'm going to spare you my Latin pronunciation. I have a B.Proc, which means I did not do Latin at university with success. I rather decided to become an attorney. So you cannot do stuff that is against the good norms and standards of the country. A ridiculous example is I offer my kidney as security for the rent, but a more practical one which we see, and which I see quite a lot, is a clause which says if I don't pay my electricity, I agree you can cut my electricity. That's taking the law into your own hands. And I hope that some of you will be joining us next week when we hope to get into the practical stuff of when things go wrong in a bit more details. If I can quickly just comment on what I would say, a good lease has the names of the parties and the property. If there's, for instance, a cottage or something, it must deal with that. It must deal with the rent, the deposit, who pays for the utilities, who pays for what maintenance, and how are utilities mentioned. It must be up to date with the Consumer Protection Act, and also deal with the early termination of the lease, which every tenant can do in appropriate circumstances. If there are house rules or conduct rules, it must reference those and they must be part of it. And to help a lawyer, there should be at least a proper domicile clause with the ability to use email for notices. So those are really biggies for us. If you tick those boxes, you would generally be dealing with a good lease. But I think the important thing for me is this. It is not, was this lease drafted by so-and-so, or I bought it from this or that person. The question is whether you understand that this is a tool in your toolbox. The question is whether you understand what is written in your lease, what your business rules are. When was it last updated? And I don't mean by you. When was it last updated by someone who knows something about their leases? And then, most importantly, do you follow your leases? Do you implement your leases fully? Or is it a set of rules that you simply have but don't necessarily implement in your rental business? Thanks, Jan. So that was my attempt at humor. I had a lot of stuff to get through. I think for those who join us next week, we'll probably be seeing some more humorous issues. Today was quite a stern session to deal with stuff. But I think the thing is we sometimes find out what the right way is, but the right way is the difficult way. And we are caught between the expectations of landlords and the fact that we've got to make a living and I've got bills to pay this month, and the fact that I sit with a difficult tenant or potentially difficult tenant. If I can leave you with homework, I would say this to you. try and develop a system of processes, follow it diligently and adapt it if you see it doesn't work. Look at your processes at least once a year and see that they're still current. Get a good toolbox, which is at least a good application form, a good lease, and proper inspection documents. Be consistent every month. Just because someone has a nice smile doesn't mean that you don't do credit control because they've got a good story. Rather do the credit control and be empathetic. Keep a lookout for your utility consumption and have a look at the way the property is looked after. And then don't assume just because the rent is being paid regularly or fairly regularly that everything is going well. Thank you for your time. Welcome, Jan, if you want to fire away with some questions.
Thank you, Hein. I'm looking at the questions and I think I'm going to read it to you and maybe you can just answer it for us then. First question is from Simone. Hi there. Why would you consider it a red flag if the tenant shows up without furniture?
I would expect most people who want to live in an unfurnished property to have furniture to bring, because that brings your personal taste and convenience and comfort to the property. From a recovery perspective, there are elements which we can discuss next week. For instance, if the rent is in arrears, the landlord has a hypothec or a lien over all the movables on the property. If you arrive without furniture, I literally have your deposit and your word. And I would personally wonder where you would sleep and what your plans were with this property.
Thanks, Hein. The second question from Edelweiss, does a tenant have to reapply for the lease agreement to be renewed?
No. This is one of our most difficult pieces of legislation to apply. We're assuming we're dealing with a fixed term lease. In other words, one that starts on day one and finishes maybe 6 months or 12 months later. That's called a fixed term lease under the Consumer Protection Act. There's no reapply. There's section 14 of the Consumer Protection Act refers. There's a notice that you send to the tenant no less than 40 business days, no later than 80 business days before the end of the lease, and where you explain to the tenant that the lease is coming up for renewal. This is the proposed escalation, and these are the terms that will change. Practically, very few people do it that way, although it is the right way. I would say to you that if you don't get a response from the tenant, if you follow the renewal discussion up there, that you need to look at section 14 and apply it. Generally speaking, if the lease comes to an end and no one has done anything, it continues month to month.
Okay, thank you. Then Sarah asked, who would pay the credit check fee on a renewal?
Parties agreed to that. I say the way.
Sorry, must that be in the agreement then?
You know, the most agreements, if you look at the standard form agreements, would have a provision that includes who pays for credit checks. I would, when I present the addendum for the credit or for the renewal, I would normally put in there a fee because there is work involved, and it is to the benefit of both landlord and tenant. The inconvenience and cost of moving suggests that if you put in 220 Rand or 250 Rand, that would be fair. But there's no law regarding that. It would otherwise fall to the agent to pay the costs.
Thank you. Then Dembi asked, I just wanted clarity on the inspection. You mentioned that it's not valid if the tenant isn't there. So I just wanted to find out if the landlord also needs to be there.
So the agent is the representative of the landlord. So the tenant has to be there. So it's either tenant or tenant representative. Got to be clear that it's someone who has the right to be there on behalf of the tenant. And the agent would normally fulfill the function of the landlord and would step into the shoes of the landlord to attend the inspection on behalf of the landlord.
Thank you. A question from, I'm just checking the time, it's 10:53. A question from Gerald. Is it legal for the rental stroke managing agent to be the only supplier of electricity tokens for their particular complex, or must the tenant stroke landlord be afforded to a second option supplier of electrical tokens? I'm not sure if that if you'd be able to answer that, Heinrich.
Look, I mean, one would need to look at the setup. It could be that that arrangement is embedded in the management rules of the scheme, and that the community schemes ombud has approved those rules. It could. I would be surprised if they did so, for the simple reason that the CPA guarantees opportunity and variety and the right to choice amongst vendors. So I would think that is that's a dangerous one. If I may just say this, and I say this anecdotally, I love chatting to my colleagues and friends like Jan. We just share ideas. You know, when I prepared for this, I looked at some leases we've seen. If Jan, are there many questions? So can I quickly just finish this point?
No, carry on.
Yeah. So you know, genetically, it is possible, for instance, let's say that you, for religious reasons, won't be able to eat the pig I referred to several times in this in this discussion, that it's possible, and it's been done, to genetically modify a pig so it doesn't tick the big boxes of a pig with a cloven hoof or this or that. In that way, there are people out there, and I've had a matter in the last 6 months where a lawyer took a lease, called it Consumer Protection Act compliant, and then broke every single rule in the Consumer Protection Act. Now, the CPA is not my specialty. I know it to the extent that we use it in property, but I can tell you there are forbidden terms in the regulations of the CPA. There are gray terms in there. And one of my colleagues tells me the other day that the Consumer Protection Ombud has really developed teeth. And I say this because the Consumer Protection Act, people in 10 years ago changed all their documents, and it was plain language, and it's kind of moved back to a place where people are taking chances again. If you get a gift voucher, suddenly it's not indefinite. You guys probably know what I'm talking about. The way developments are marketed, all of these things. I hear the other day that the Consumer Ombud is currently dishing out fines of R1 million upwards if they find instances where people are manipulating the Consumer Protection Act and defrauding clients. And I actually wonder, in a situation like that, I'm not sticking my nose into someone's business, but I'm wondering if you took that up with a Consumer Ombud, what they would say. It may be worth getting a separate legal opinion before you do that. But if it's a monopoly, and I assume there's a margin built in that's beyond what NERSA allows in their tariffs, there could be problems for that supplier.
Thanks, Hein. Another question from Edelweiss. Our lease agreement asks for an alternative address where a tenant can move to in the event of an eviction. What are the implications if the tenant cannot provide such an address?
So the lease you're referring to, I know the provision you're referring to. I see it a lot. I know which organization encourages people to have that. I personally have an opinion about that, but it'll be my personal opinion. If you can't provide an alternative address, it's up to the landlord and agent to decide whether they want to accept you as a tenant. I personally feel that the alternative address is a tool that will be used if there's an eviction application, but with none of the evictions that I've ever successfully completed have had an alternative address, and I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. And there's a question, but I'm not going to ask you to commit yourself now. We can discuss it afterwards and I can send it out. Can Hein do a compliance audit on our legal rental document? And if so, what will the cost be? If you don't want to commit to that now, so leave that and then we can just move on to the next question and then we can discuss it afterwards and I can send it out or even discuss it at next week's meeting. Okay with that?
I may respond to that separately. I have to tell you, I'm not a commercial attorney per se. I can see what's wrong with people's documents. I obviously sit and scrutinize them. And I can, I'm happy to point people in the right direction and give guidance. So may very well assist in that regard.
All right. AD, hi, Heinrich. If a managed lease is not renewed and the tenant stays on month to month, is the agent still entitled to the management fee? And if so, for how long? Can the landlord then cancel the management on a month to month?
Very good question.
It's
a very good question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Eddie.
So this is a very controversial point. We typically, when you do a tenant placement and you manage, everything happens quickly. You try and do as little documents as possible with the landlord. My model is I will not, in our property management business, manage your property if you don't sign a mandate. Not a sale mandate, a rental mandate. Because the rental mandate protects me if things go wrong. It makes sure that both of us know what our roles are. And it makes sure that you know how you can fire me or vice versa. And I think it's very unfair that people fish off the company pier, so to speak, by going to a tenant and simply taking over the tenant. I'm not fond of that, but in law, you'd look at your lease and see what you guys agreed there. If there's nothing there, go look at your emails, maybe where you presented the tenant to the landlord, and see how that unfolded. And then hopefully you have a mandate. Maybe you have signed one. And if you haven't signed one, I can encourage you to do that because you do all the other hard work. You build your toolbox. Why not have a simple rental mandate with your landlord where we understand each other and we understand what is fair business practice?
Okay, great, Heinrich. Thank you so much. It's all the questions. There's just one last one from Andy Price. Ask if a copy of the recording can be sent. So we are recording this webinar, and just on your WhatsApps, or send me a WhatsApp with your contact details and just ask me, or make it the other way around. Once the recording is ready to be sent out, I will inform you guys, and then you can just let me know who wants the recording. I think that will make it so much easier. There might be another last question. I see it is 11 o'clock. That's from Mary. When two parties were involved in the lease, is it allowed to do an addendum to change the parties?
Yes, absolutely. So we are dealing with people who reach consensus. You can remove one party very easily, leaving the other party in the lease. Landlord must just be absolutely sure they understand the risk and understand the consequences. The one thing that you do need to just take note of, and people forget that, is don't assume the party who stays behind is the owner of the deposit. It may very well be that. So if you take someone out and you put someone in, you'd have on the one hand the landlord, and the other hand you'll have the incoming tenant, and you'll also have the outgoing tenant, and obviously the remaining tenant. So get everyone to agree that the deposit can be transferred with the interest.
And I think for the same question that Mary asked is, you can add people to the lease agreement as well, can't you?
Absolutely. As I said earlier, what I would do in those circumstances, Everyone who joins the party, let them sign an application. If needs be, let's get some background on them. Do your credit check, get your bank statements. The more the merrier. If you are the agent, you've got more strength in more parties. As long as you're not overcrowding, just check your rules in your scheme if there's a scheme applicable. But for the most part, the more the merrier. We have lease management leases where we have 4 people on the lease with a clear understanding that only 2 stay there. Could be their parents or whoever joins. Yeah.
Okay. Heinrich, thank you so much. I think it was excellent. We've definitely learned quite a bit. People, next week, Wednesday, same place, same time. Heinrich will be the speaker again, and it will be more about evictions, how to avoid it, etc. Please join us. I will send the link next week, Tuesday, to you. And if you want me to email it, but I'll communicate with you on WhatsApp. On the left of your screen, you see Heinrich's telephone number and email address. You're welcome to chat to him and make use of his services. And that's it. Thank you.